I wanted to begin by saying I'm deeply honored to be part of this panel, part of this conference as a non-Muslim. And that points to the question that I get asked so often. People ask me, they say, Caleb, you know, you're an American guy from Ohio, you're a Christian, you're a leftist, you're a socialist. Why do you talk so much about the situation in the Middle East, the plight of Shia Muslims, about Iran? Why do you talk about this so much? And I've had to think about how I answer that question. And the answer that I've come up with is something like this. I tell the people who ask me this, I say, I want you to imagine that here in the United States of America, there was some kind of priest or preacher, and he was going around the United States and saying that he believed in not capitalism, but Christianity. And that he said that he was for the oppressed, and that his movement believed that all people were equal in the eyes of God, and that no racism could be tolerated, that no discrimination of any kind could be tolerated, and that his mass movement lifted up the most downtrodden people, and that he called for a war of poverty against wealth and mobilizing the poor for justice. And millions of people followed this movement and made great sacrifices, and that organizations were built called the Mobilization of the Oppressed that began building hospitals and schools and providing basic services to people. And I say to them, if such a movement was taking place in the United States, if you call yourself a progressive, if you call yourself a socialist, if you call yourself someone who is concerned about social justice, you would have to have something to do with that movement. Right? You might disagree with it on one point or another, but you would have to relate to it in some way. And I tell people that's what Imam Khomeini was in Iran, and that's what Sheikh Ibrahim Zakzaki is in Nigeria. And that's what Amir al-Amir, the sheikh who was brutally killed by the Saudis, that's what he was doing as well. And that if you call yourself a progressive, you can't put up a barrier and say, well, these people have a different religion than me, I can't associate with them. Or these people, they think this way, or they disagree with me about this issue, I can't associate with them. That's not what progressive people should be doing. And I want to say that it seems like something that you can learn very easily when you look throughout history. That when you subjugate one group of people, and you subject them to demonization, and you stigmatize them, by doing that, you can effectively oppress all of society. Right? Take Bahrain, for example. Now, Bahrain, this is a country, the majority of the people are Shia, and they have a government imposed on them by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, an autocratic government. And there are all kinds of people in Bahrain who want democracy and freedom, and the right to associate with who they want to associate with, and the right to say what they want to say. There's all kinds of people who do that in Bahrain. But the way that the Western media and the way the regime there has been able to suppress the people in Bahrain who don't want to be oppressed any longer is to say, oh, this is Sunni versus Shia. This is an ethnic conflict. Don't pay any attention to it. This is something you can't understand. And you look at, Nigeria. This is a country that has been colonized. It's one of the richest countries on the African continent. At this point, it's actually the top oil exporting country on the African continent. But the people there are deeply impoverished. The life expectancy is very low. The rate of literacy is very low. Child labor goes on there at very high rates. You can look at some of the pictures of the Niger Delta region. This is the richest, most oil-rich region in all of Africa. And you can see beaches that are black with oil and children playing on these oil beaches with nothing. I mean, the poverty that people are living in. Such a wealthy country, but so impoverished by the rule of Western bankers and corporations. And how have the imperialists been able to keep the country so poor? By playing the Christians against the Muslims, right? By fomenting ethnic and religious divisions to keep the country impoverished. And yet you have Sheikh Ibrahim Zakzaki, a Muslim, who was trying to bring together these two communities and create dialogue, and was doing everything he could to move the Muslim community away from the terrorists like Boko Haram, and to have dialogue with Christians and to try and bring people together. And now you have the military dragging him away, attacking Zaria, attacking the Shia community, the Islamic movement of Nigeria. Or you can take the situation in Yemen. The way U.S. media talks about Yemen, they say, well, this is a war that you can't understand. That's their message to average Americans. This is too complicated. You can't understand it. And there are these people called the Houthis, and they're somehow involved with Iran, and it's just a big mess, and just look the other way. And in reality, if you look at the situation in Yemen, it's not just the Ansar Allah organization, it's the entire country. There is the southern movement of people in the south of Yemen that want to bring back the Democratic People's Republic of Yemen. There is the followers of the former President Saleh, nationalists. But all of them don't want Yemen to continue to be a colony of Saudi Arabia. But by whipping up this stigma and saying that this is simply a Sunni-Shia conflict, that this is simply the Shia versus the Saudis, and it's a way of marginalizing and obscuring the truth about what's actually taking place. And probably the most insulting way that this narrative is put forward is that they try to present these conflicts that are taking place, like the people in Bahrain struggling for democracy, like the people of Yemen trying to control their own country. They try to portray this as if this is all because of Iran. Right? The people of Bahrain, they don't want to be free. They're getting money from Iran. They're out there fighting because Iran did it. Right? People of Yemen, they don't want to be free. Right? They just want to remain a Saudi colony, but the Iranians are there. And doesn't it remind you of how when Martin Luther King Jr. was marching for civil rights in this country, they said, oh, he's a communist. He's a Russian agent. It's the Soviets that are behind it. It's the same kind of rhetoric. People can't be free. They're just puppets of the foreign agitators. And I went on a ship, as was mentioned in my introduction. I went on the Iran Shahid ship with the Red Crescent Society of Iran. I got on that ship, and it was a life-changing experience. I was on that ship for 13 days, and when you're on a ship, in the middle of the Gulf of Aden, for 13 days, and there's very few people on that ship who speak any English, and you're like me, a product of our great American educational system, and you don't speak any foreign language except English, you have a lot of time to talk, right? You have a lot of time to engage with people, and we talked about everything. And I remember some of the younger people from Iran, they were saying to me, they were talking about television or something, and they said, and they mentioned The Message, a film about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and I had never seen it. You've never seen The Message? How can you have not seen The Message? And then later I said something, I made passing conversation to Elvis Presley, the rock singer, and they said, who? And I said, you've never heard of Elvis? So, it was kind of an interesting time. But we didn't get to Yemen. And the reason we did not get to Yemen was because we were scheduled to arrive at the port of Hodeidah. And on the day we were scheduled to arrive, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia bombed that port 8 times in a single day. Just demolished the place, killed all kinds of dock workers. They then bombed the medical university in Hodeidah, where there were medical students who were just trying to learn how to take care of Yemeni people and provide aid in the middle of just a horrendous war. They were killed. It was horrendous. And it was in that situation that we ultimately had to turn our ship around. We went to Djibouti. We ended up docking in Djibouti. The ship was unloaded. The claims that were all throughout Western media that we were somehow smuggling weapons were disproven as they unloaded our ship. UN workers unloaded our ship and saw we had nothing but flour and medical supplies and humanitarian aid. It was a humanitarian mission with the Red Crescent Society. And, I ended up in Djibouti and ended up getting back to Iran. And when I got off the plane in Iran, I remember I was picked up at the airport by a very prominent Iranian filmmaker. And I remember I was just like, wow, that was 13 days, and I was just kind of overwhelmed with everything. So I got into the car with this very prominent Iranian filmmaker, and we're driving, through the streets of Tehran, and we're talking about all kinds of things, and he's telling me about, we're just talking about movies and just life. And I remember one thing came up in the conversation, and this conversation stuck with me. He said to me, Caleb, do you think there's any chance that Mel Gibson would ever come to Iran? And I paused for a moment, being a Westerner like I am, my mind immediately went to the bigoted things that Mel Gibson has said. And I said, I'm not sure you would want that and all that. And he looked at me funny and he said, Caleb, have you ever seen Braveheart, the movie? And I said, yes. He said, have you ever seen The Patriot? And I said, yes. He said, have you ever seen The Passion of the Christ? And I said, yes. And he said, those movies are so well loved here in Iran, because it really incarnates what Shia and the revolutionary Islamic tradition is about. And I said, whoa. And I just paused there for a moment. And I thought about how I had gotten where I was. And I thought about, long before I was an activist, long before I was a journalist, I was a little boy in Ohio who loved the movie Braveheart and loved this ideal of people who go out and struggle for justice. And maybe they're so committed to their ideals and they believe in what is right so hard that they would give their life to fight for justice in the world. And I thought about that, and I thought about, wow, you know, there's not that much of a gap between the people of the United States and the people of Iran. You know, as much as they try to demonize Iran and tell us the Iranians are our enemies, deep down we have very similar ideals. We both love justice and we both hate tyranny. And I got to tell you that there are a lot of kids like me, you know, from Ohio. And I think all across the United States, a lot of people are starting to realize that we've been sold a bill of goods as Americans. We've been told a lot of lies. And you know, we know that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia doesn't represent the people of the Arabian Peninsula, that it was selected. The House of Saud was picked by Western bankers and corporations. It was selected to rule over that area. And let's be real, you know, those same corporations and big bankers, they dominate and control the United States. And the standard of living across the United States is dropping. And people are getting angry. And, you know, they talk about the rise of Trump. They talk about the rise of Bernie Sanders. This is just the beginning. Because people here in the United States are tired of what's going on, and they're fed up with the same global order that is fomenting all this injustice throughout the world and in the Middle East. So I think that this is an optimistic moment, and I think that there are many Americans that if they heard the speeches that we've heard here today, if they were able to hear the message and understand the reality of what's going on here, they would be open to having peace with so many forces around the world, and they wouldn't buy into the lies used to spread war and deception. So I thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Let's start the Q&A with Caleb, if I could get you to answer this question. Let's start with a country that doesn't get reported at all, Nigeria. We are told this is another place which is where there's a Saudi Arabia versus Iran proxy war. And there's another Sunni versus Shia sectarian conflict. First, in July of 2014, Nigerian army shot and killed 35 unarmed Shias in an Al-Quds procession. Then in December of 2015, a day after Sheikh Zakzaki's son returns after giving an anti-Zionism speech in the Conference on Palestine, the army attacks the compound and then kills everybody in sight. 350 dead, over 600 injured. It was a massacre. And Amnesty International published satellite pictures showing mass graves. Second, Nigerian President Buhari visits Saudi Arabia right after the Zaria massacre and was given a state honor by opening the gates of Kaaba to him. Boko Haram attack the followers of Sheikh Zakzaki all the time. Wahhabi Takfiri clerics in Nigeria declared Shias as heretics. Third, Sheikh was attracting thousands of non-Shias as his message was about the African empowerment and self-reliance. Remember, Nigeria is the largest oil producer, like Caleb said. Question: would Sheikh Zakzaki be in jail today with 6 of his sons killed if he was not against the trio of Zionism, Wahhabism, and Western independence? Please.
All right. Well, I want to say that, you know, it's no coincidence in my mind that what happened in Zaria took place in the immediate aftermath of the signing of the Iran deal. It was very shortly afterwards. And it seemed that there was a faction in the United States and in Israel that was deeply offended by the signing of the Iran nuclear deal. And you'll also notice that the execution of Ayatollah Nimir al-Nimir in Saudi Arabia also took place in the aftermath of this. And it seemed like there was a division within the powers that be over the Iran nuclear deal. And in the aftermath of it, there was efforts, just big efforts to retaliate, not against Iran, but against the Shia community of the world. And that this attack took place. And again, the media really likes to play up the idea that this is some kind of division that you can't understand. You know, they start throwing out words like, you know, like Sunni, Shia, Houthi, all kinds of words to just kind of confuse the public and not get them to realize that the Nigerian government is very close to the Saudi government, and it's also very close to the U.S. government. That Buhari, one of the first places he went, I believe it was the first country he visited, if I'm not mistaken, after being elected, was the United States, to sit down with U.S. President Barack Obama. And that raid in Zaria that happened in the immediate aftermath of the signing of the Iran nuclear deal was not a coincidence. It wasn't a random occurrence. It wasn't an internal matter for Nigeria. It was a faction within the power structure responding to the Iran nuclear deal. And that you know, I mean, you know, there was that whole campaign, Bring Back Our Girls, right? And people know about the horrors committed by Boko Haram. What
what horrified me, and Menard spoke very beautifully about the way media just distorts everything, is that some of the very little coverage of this in Western media almost gave you the impression that somehow Sheikh Zakzaki, who himself is working to build unity between Christians and Muslims and to work and isolate the Boko Haram terrorists, they tried to almost link him in their coverage to Boko Haram, the very group that he's done so much to struggle against, and to try and inflame the Christian community of Nigeria and the Christian community of the African diaspora against him. It was really tragic. And so in that instant, we see a real distortion of the reality. And it shows how well connected everything is, and how well connected global events really are. You can't separate one event and say it just takes place in this country. It's just a complicated thing. These are people that have been fighting for thousands of years. How often have we heard that, right? Thousands of years these people are fighting. Just look the other way. No, you can't separate these things. That the world is deeply connected, especially in the age of technology that we have now. That if Iran were not an independent country that had toppled a brutally U.S.-backed dictator and established a new government that built, I mean, you should see the level of development, you know, and I mean, highways, power plants, electricity, I mean, the level that they have taken, the measures that they have taken to raise the standard of living in the country is just massive. If they had not broken their country out of the global Western system, if they had not, become such an outspoken force of opposition to Israel and to Zionism, they would not be facing the level of attack that they're facing. And I have to remind people, and it's sad because I'm sure everyone in the room here knows this, but out in the wider world, I have to remind people that that Iran's Revolutionary Guards, who have just been declared terrorists by the Trump administration, have given their lives. So many of them given their lives on the battlefield to defeat ISIS. Right? These are people that are on the front lines fighting against the ISIS terrorists, and they have been declared terrorists by the U.S. government. And when I was in Tehran, they took me to a graveyard near the capital city, near Tehran, and I saw some of these Revolutionary Guards being buried and their families there. And I talked to them, and they said to me, "Look, you're an American. Who attacked us on 9/11? Right? Who attacked you on 9/11? That was Al Qaeda. That was the Saudis." Right? Why can't the United States and Iran be getting along? We're both terrified of ISIS terrorism. It's the Wahhabis that are committing these bombings and destructions. You go to Iran, people love the United States there. American movies, American clothing, everything. I mean, it's there's no reason for the United States and Iran to be enemies. Meanwhile, the main force these terrorist attacks that scare everyone, that people die, and the horrendous things that we see on the news, the source of that is Saudi Arabia and Saudi ideology. And that fact is so widely obscured that I just can't stop repeating that. I know everyone here knows that, but when I'm in the wider world, I have to just keep telling people this truth. You watch the news and your head just wants to explode. It's so widely distorted, the reality of the situation, that Iran does not want to harm the United States. Iran has no interest in harming us. In Iran they use the slogan, "Death to America," right? And that often gets highlighted. People say, well, the Iranians, they chant "Death to America." That means they want to come here and kill us all. No, it doesn't. They're not chanting "Death to me" and "Death to my family." As far as they're concerned, they identify America with a global system of imperialism. To them, America is war, it's empire, it's grinding countries into poverty, it's mass destruction. It's not, everyday people on the street. And I feel like the very system that Iranians are chanting against when they chant "Death to America" is causing a lot of problems here in the United States right now, with the rise of opioid addiction that is taking place, with the dropping standard of living. And I think a lot of Americans are just as angry as the Iranians are at that system that puts profits before basic human life. So that's my answer to that question.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Fahar Zedi. I'm an interim medicine trained physician from Michigan. Sister Menard mentioned something, and I just wanted to get a little bit more information about it. It seems like Western imperialism is kind of fed off on creating this common enemy throughout the history, be it blacks, be it communists, and so on and so forth. And in the last couple of decades, it seems like the focus has shifted towards the Muslims being the common enemy throughout the world. How can we, as a journalist, reach out to American people? And Caleb, maybe you can answer this too, and have this dialogue with the general American community? Thank you.
I think one thing that would help is there needs to be, some emphasis. For example, growing up in Ohio, being in school when 9/11 happened, and then ending up being in Iran, one of the things that I learned in Iran that I have never been confronted with ever was that the Islamic faith has deep admiration for Jesus Christ. That fact has been so widely obscured, right? That the way Islam was presented to me as someone who grew up as a Christian was that they would quote one passage from the Quran that says that Christ is not the Son of God, and so therefore that was dismissed as the entire Islamic understanding. But to understand that Jesus Christ is so widely loved in the Islamic world and recognized for his achievements and for what he did and for laying down his life and all that, that's a fact that needs to be highlighted. I think that a lot of Americans, if they actually were to know more about Islam, would be more sympathetic to Islam than they would be to Israel. I think that's a reality. And that so much has been really obscured. And that information needs to be more widely accessible. The level of ignorance is very extreme. Before I went to Iran the first time, I remember somebody in my family said to me, you should be very careful, because Iran is an ISIS country. I said, what do you mean? They said, well, it's an Islamic State, it's Islamic Republic, isn't that like the same thing? And I said, no. I said, Iran is on the battlefield fighting against ISIS, but this is where people are at. But in this age of media being so widely accessible, and so much information being out there, there's no excuse for this level of ignorance to persist. And we all have a duty to spread the truth that we know, throughout the world. I'll tell you, I went to church on Sunday morning in Iran. Beautiful, beautiful church, an Armenian Christian church. I went to Sunday morning service there. That was in Iran. And, I said, after going to that church service that Christians in Iran are treated far better than Muslims are treated in the United States. It's just a beautiful church. We went in, and women, they do require women to wear the hijab. But inside of the church, that was not required. Communion wine was permitted, which outside alcohol is not allowed, but even within the walls of the church, communion wine was permitted. What are things like in Saudi Arabia? You hear stories of people, people being arrested for owning Bibles in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the persecution of Christians in Saudi Arabia is a very extreme reality. So, but yet, Trump, and he's got Mike Pence, who claims he's this great evangelical. He loves the Saudis, and he hates the Iranians. In Syria, right? The Syrian government has protected the Christian minority in Syria. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia and the United States have been backing forces that literally chant at their rally, expel the Christians. Expel the Christians. This is one of the chants the Takfiris use in their rallies against the Syrian government. Their grievance against the Syrian government is that it allows Christians to practice their faith, it allows the Alawi community to practice their faith. They want something like Saudi Arabia and Syria. So why in the world are we as Americans on the side of the folks that are wanting to kill the Christian community and expel them? This is just a delusion. It's funny because Menard talked about the war on terror and how terrorism has so widely expanded since the launch of the war on terror. That's because we're not fighting the terrorists. We're fighting the enemies of the terrorists, right? Saddam Hussein, he was an enemy of Al-Qaeda, right? Gaddafi was someone who had fought against Al-Qaeda. Bashar Assad, that government there, has fought against Al-Qaeda. We go around the world not fighting the terrorists, but fighting the people that are fighting the terrorists. And I think a lot of Americans, if they could understand that we're essentially operating as Al-Qaeda's air force throughout that Middle Eastern region, if they could understand that, they would be furious. I think they really would be. And that's why the work that we do in spreading the truth in a world of lies is so, so important. I just wanted to add this, because one thing that I became aware of when I was on the ship going to Yemen, and as I was being educated very much about the situation there, is that, I became aware of one thing about the Houthis or the Ansarullah group that gets really obscured, which is their logo. And it's interesting, you'll never see their logo on television, and you'll never have it explain what it's about. But, the logo, it has a hand pointing up to represent God and serving God. It has a gun showing the right to armed self-defense, and they actually believe, it is in their belief that every household, the man of every household must have a firearm. The right to bear arms, the Second Amendment would be very popular there. And the other thing, though, the third thing, though, that is very important is the shaft of wheat
right? There's a shaft of wheat on their logo. And what that stands for is economic development. And it's the fact that Yemen, you know, this is a country that is deeply poor, one of the poorest countries in the world. I mean, and yet it's in one of the wealthiest regions. It has untapped oil deposits, and really, what Saudi Arabia is trying to do is trying to keep Yemen poor. That's what it's about. It's about keeping this country in a state of extreme poverty. And you know, there's an interview that with BBC that one leader of the Ansarullah organization gave, and they asked him. They say, you know, they say that you, the Houthi organization, are tied to Iran. And he said the only reason they bring up Iran is to sow sectarian religious division. They said, yes, we're inspired by Khomeini and the revolution of Iran. He said, but we're also inspired by Venezuela and Hugo Chavez. And he said, quote, this is a quote, "We stand with the oppressed everywhere in the world." And I just thought that was deeply beautiful.